The morning light in coastal Oregon in 1993 has a kind of quiet honesty to it, gray, pale, undecided. It spills over the valley, gliding across the wet rooftops and the winding Tulane road that leads out of the small town of Ashbrook. Somewhere beyond that fog, the Pacific waits, endlessly moving yet always still. The camera would move slowly here, as if afraid to disturb what's about to disappear. The story begins not with scream or discovery, but with the kind of silence that lingers before a life changes course forever. Clara Dwyer was 17, and she didn't know she was walking into the last morning of her life. She had tied her hair into a loose braid, pulled on a denim jacket that smelled faintly of sea air, and left the house at 7:14 a.m., according to her mother's memory. Her father said it was earlier, maybe 7:10. Small differences that would grow into cracks in the timeline later. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. Clara always walked to school. She liked the quiet of the road, the trees dripping with dew, the sound of crows arguing above the power lines. But that morning, something felt slightly off, though no one could name what it was. By noon, her friends assumed she'd stayed homesick. By 3, when she didn't show up for afternoon choir practice, the first ripples of worry began to form. By sunset, her mother stood in the kitchen doorway, staring down the empty road that should have brought Clara back. A dinner plate sat untouched. The Dwyer home, white walls, framed photographs, the smell of lemon cleaner, felt suddenly too large, too hollow. When Martha Dwyer finally picked up the phone to call the sheriff's office, she said the words that would echo through Ashbrook for years. "My daughter went to school this morning. She didn't come home." In a town where nothing ever really happens, disappearance feels like fiction until it isn't. The local deputy, who'd known Clara since she was a child, thought it might be a runaway situation at first. Maybe she'd taken a bus to Portland. Maybe a boyfriend was involved. But by the second day, when her backpack was found near a bus stop she never used, and no one confirmed seeing her after 7:30 a.m., something darker began to take shape. Flyers went up on telephone poles. The local radio station repeated her description every hour. Volunteers gathered with flashlights and dogs, combing through the woods behind the high school. The forest swallowed their shouts, their hopes, their fear. The voice of the narrator here would slow down, lower slightly, describing the ache of not knowing. Every missing person story begins the same way, with questions so small they seem almost harmless. What time did she leave? What was she wearing? Who was the last to see her? But behind those questions hides something vast and cold, the understanding that memory itself cannot be trusted. People start to misremember, to edit. The truth begins to bend. By the 4th day, local news vans had parked along the narrow road leading to the Dwyer's property. Reporters interviewed neighbors who suddenly remembered strange noises, odd sightings, fragments that might mean something or nothing at all. A classmate recalled Clara acting distracted that week, sketching circles in her notebook margins. Another said she'd been talking about leaving town, though no one knew why. The sheriff gave calm, careful statements about ongoing investigations and community cooperation. Words meant a comfort, but that only deepened the unease. And through it all, the house at the end of Birchwood Lane stood like a wound that wouldn't close. Martha sat in the living room beside the phone, her posture so still it looked like she was holding her breath. Paul Dwyer, her husband, walked in and out of rooms without speaking, like a ghost haunting his own home. Friends brought food, left prayers, whispered comfort that didn't land. The walls began to close in. The nights grew longer, and the silence became unbearable. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't shout. It hums. You can feel it in the corners of the story, in the way the mother flinches at sudden sounds. The father keeps staring at the edge of the forest, as if something out there might be staring back. It's not just grief. It's recognition. The faint, terrible feeling that this disappearance didn't come from nowhere, that it was already seated long before that April morning. The narrator's tone would now shift, quieter, almost confessional. Sometimes the story of a disappearance doesn't begin the day someone goes missing. Sometimes it starts years earlier, hidden beneath the surface of what looked like an ordinary life. In a town like Ashbrook, people prefer neat endings. But this story, the story of Clara Dwyer, will never be neat. It will unravel in slow circles, leading us back through secrets buried beneath decades of silence, through the fog that never truly lifts from the Oregon woods. The first section closes with an image: the empty road, the morning mist still hovering low, and a single blue ribbon tied to a tree, a remnant from the search effort that has already begun to fade in the weather. The camera lingers there, unblinking, as if waiting for a girl who will never return. The Dwyer family had always been seen as a picture of small-town perfection. On the surface, they were the kind of people who made neighbors feel reassured just by existing in the same cul-de-sac. Martha Dwyer, a woman in her early 40s with meticulously styled brown hair and a tendency toward cheerful gestures, baked pies for every holiday and hosted church gatherings that were the envy of Ashbrook. Her laughter, measured and polite, carried easily through the town square, creating an illusion of warmth and normalcy. Paul Dwyer, by contrast, was a man of few words, broad-shouldered and quiet. He worked long hours at the local lumber mill and often arrived home covered in sawdust, his face unreadable. Together, they presented a household that radiated stability. Two parents devoted to their daughter, their home well-kept, the kind of life that could be neatly summarized in photographs of birthdays and family holidays. Yet, as anyone who has ever peered into the quiet corners of a family knows, the polished exterior can hide fissures that never fully heal. Neighbors who had known the Dwyer for decades recall moments that, in hindsight, seemed strange or ominous. There were reports of Martha insisting that Clara never speak about certain family matters, explanations offered with a tightness of her smile that belied tension. Paul, while generally gentle, could disappear for hours without explanation, leaving Clara to navigate the weight of unspoken rules. To the outside world, these were trivial details, small eccentricities in an otherwise ideal household. But for a teenager with innate curiosity and perceptiveness, they were impossible to ignore. Clara's friends noticed how she would hesitate before answering questions about her home, how she sometimes flinched when her mother's voice rose in pitch, even during casual conversations. The home itself mirrored this duality of outward perfection and inward tension. Light spilled through lace-curtained windows in the morning, illuminating carefully arranged furniture, picture frames, and bookshelves that seemed to be organized with particular, almost ritualistic precision. Yet in corners of the house, doors would remain closed for days, the sounds of shuffling, whispered conversations, or sudden silences drifting faintly through the walls. It was in these spaces that Clara's young mind began to notice the undercurrents of control and secrecy that shaped her world. She would scribble thoughts into margins of her school notebooks, poems filled with metaphorical doors and shadows, signs an inner life wrestling with forces she couldn't yet name. Friends described Clara as sweet, generous, and perceptive, someone who often absorbed the moods of others before speaking herself. She laughed easily but had an intensity that sometimes unsettled people. She noticed patterns, inconsistencies, and moments of avoidance that adults dismissed. In her diary, which would later become the key to unraveling the family's hidden past, Clara wrote about nights when the house felt too heavy, as though it itself were watching her, listening for the wrong word. She spoke of her mother's sharp eyes, of the feeling that speaking too much could make the air brittle, dangerous. And yet, she also wrote of fleeting tenderness, of times when Paul would share a quiet smile or a nod that seemed to offer reassurance, a subtle reminder that she was loved, but under conditions she did not fully understand. The contrast between the public and private lives of the Dwyers began to crystallize more clearly in the months before Clara's disappearance. Neighbors would see Martha in church Sunday after Sunday, chatting warmly, always impeccably dressed, while inside the house she could transform into a figure of strict, sometimes suffocating authority. Paul's silence, which to outsiders seemed stoic or reserved, was a wall of containment, keeping both his emotions and the truth of the household tucked away. For Clara, every day was a negotiation with the invisible boundaries that defined what could be said, what could be felt, and what must be hidden. Her diary became a lifeline, a space where she could speak freely without fear of immediate consequence, though the weight of knowing someone might eventually read it lingered in her careful phrasing and coded entries. As the town of Ashbrook remembers the Dwyers, it recalls them as the perfect family, the kind you might imagine in a storybook illustration of suburban life. But behind closed doors, a different story existed, one of fear softened by habit, of love tempered by control, and of a young girl whose keen awareness of these dynamics would eventually guide her toward truths that no adult dared to speak aloud. The Dwyer home, with its quiet halls, pristine floors, and polite smiles, was not merely a setting. It was a character in itself, shaping the movements, thoughts, and emotions of those who lived within it. And in the shadows of its beauty and order, the seeds of Clara's eventual disappearance were quietly, inevitably taking root. The morning Clara disappeared began like any other in Ashbrook, Oregon. Yet by the end of it, the town would sense the first tremors of something deeply wrong. The sun rose pale and hesitant, brushing silver light over the roofs and roads that Clara had walked so many times before. She left her house at 7:14 a.m., the denim jacket she favored snug around her shoulders, her hair loosely braided down her back. She carried a backpack filled with books, notebooks, and a sense of routine, as if the day itself were safe and predictable. Yet safety that morning was an illusion. Clara's walk to school followed the familiar path through the sleepy streets, past the small grocer with its smell of fresh bread, past the old church where the bell rang sharply at 7:30 a.m., past the playground where swings creaked in the wind. Witness accounts later would differ in small ways. One classmate remembered seeing her pause near a corner store. A neighbor thought she waved at a passing car. These minor discrepancies, almost trivial at the time, would later become critical in reconstructing the timeline, the fragments of memory stretching and bending as the investigation unfolded. By 8 a.m., Clara had vanished from anyone's confirmed sight. The first uncertainty emerged quietly. A friend waiting at the bus stop noticed she never arrived. A teacher marked her absent, assuming illness. But when the lunch bell rang and she still had not appeared, small worries began to ripple through her circle of classmates. No one spoke the word missing yet. It was too early. There was still hope that she had simply been delayed, that she would appear in the next class, her laugh breaking the tension, her presence grounding the day in normalcy. Afternoon arrived, and with it, unease grew more tangible. Choir practice went on without her. Friends sent quick notes. Phones rang unanswered, and a feeling of dread began to take shape in the back of everyone's mind. By 3 o'clock, the whispers started, questions repeated like a chant. Where is she? Did anyone see her this morning? Could she have gone somewhere on her own? The town, small and tight-knit, could feel the absence of one of its children as a physical thing. A hollow space where life had once been, now vibrating with uncertainty. By the time Martha and Paul Dwyer realized that Clara had not returned home, the clock had edged toward evening. Martha, in the kitchen, had set the table, untouched plates reflecting the fading light from a window. Paul had walked past the rooms, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if testing the air, trying to detect the missing presence before the heart could fully acknowledge the absence. The parents' first calls to the neighbors were met with blank expressions. No one had seen her. And then came the call to the sheriff, the first official recognition that something had gone wrong. The sheriff's office, small and accustomed to routine town matters, initially treated the case cautiously. A 17-year-old might run away. Curiosity, rebellion, and a desire for independence could all explain a sudden disappearance. But then, the details began to accumulate, forming a pattern too sharp to ignore. Clara's backpack, neatly placed near a bus stop she never used, suggested she had intended to leave or that someone else had orchestrated her movements. Witnesses recalled seeing a car slow on the street near her usual path, but no one could identify the driver. By sunset, the search had begun, but the forest behind the school, the road snaking through the valley, and the riverbanks that gleamed under fading lights swallowed every lead, every sound, every hope. The emotional texture of this day was a careful mixture of panic, confusion, and quiet horror. It was in the small details. The way Martha's hands trembled over the telephone receiver, the blankness in Paul's eyes as he scanned the horizon, the tight grip of friends holding onto each other while they called out Clara's name. Each moment compounded the sense of unease, a growing realization that the familiar world of Ashbrook could no longer be trusted. What had been ordinary, the morning light, the school bell, the gentle rhythm of a small town, now held the sharp edge of uncertainty. Volunteers, neighbors, and local authorities moved through the day with flashlights, maps, and dogs, combing the woods where Clara was last reported. The forest, dense with firs and pines, seemed to absorb their shouts, their hope, their fear. Every rustle of leaves became a potential clue, every shadow a haunting possibility. The search extended into the night, candles flickering in windows as townspeople whispered her name, clinging to the fragile belief that she might still be found. By the end of that day, the story had shifted from a routine concern to a crisis. The absence of Clara Dwyer was no longer just a matter of a teenager possibly wandering off. It was a palpable void. The town could feel it in the silence between the searchers, in the empty swing sets, in the homes where families paused their routines to wonder if their own children were safe. That first day set the tone for the weeks and months to come. Uncertainty, fear, and the haunting question that would echo relentlessly through Ashbrook. What happened to Clara Dwyer? The morning of her disappearance, simple and mundane, had become the first page in a story that would unravel secrets, challenge perceptions, and reveal the cracks hidden beneath the perfect surface of a small Oregon town. Days slipped into a kind of haunted rhythm after Clara's disappearance, each one marked by the same anxious pattern. Search parties moving to the dense Oregon forest, neighbors scanning the roads, and the sheriff's office coordinating what felt like an endless effort to recover a girl who had vanished without a trace. The woods behind the high school and the logging trails that led deeper into the pine-covered hills became the center of attention. Dogs picked up faint scents that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and searchers reported hearing branches snap or distant echoes of movement that seemed almost deliberate, as if the forest itself were aware of their intrusion. Every leaf, every shadow, every curve of the river became a potential clue, and yet the deeper they searched, the more the woods refused to give up their secrets. Nature seemed almost like a character in its own right during those days. Mist hung low over the river in the early mornings, curling around trunks and weaving through ferns like something sentient, hiding pathways and erasing footprints. Rain fell in the afternoons, turning the dirt roads into slick, muddy trails, erasing the faint traces that the volunteer searchers worked so tirelessly to follow. The cold, gray Oregon sky cast the world in muted shades, making every movement appear larger than it was, and every sound sharper, more urgent. The environment became both ally and adversary, helping conceal Clara, while simultaneously amplifying the town's collective anxiety. Inside the Dwyer home, time began to take on a surreal quality. Martha Dwyer, once composed and orderly, started to unravel in small, almost imperceptible ways. She would move from room to room, tidying, rearranging, straightening, as if the act itself had conjured Clara back into existence. Every knock at the door, every ring of the telephone caused her to jump, a stark contrast to her usual controlled demeanor. Paul remained largely silent, a presence that was both protective and unknowable. He would walk the perimeter of the property, staring toward the tree-line, his expression fixed, his eyes reflecting an internal struggle that he refused to voice. The home, like the forest outside, seemed to breathe tension and uncertainty. Community response was immediate and relentless. Volunteers gathered in groups, flashlights cutting through the dense underbrush, calling Clara's name until their voices grew hoarse. Flyers bearing her photograph were posted everywhere. Utility poles, store windows, school bulletin boards, and even along the edges of the forest trails. The town collectively held its breath, each person internalizing the same fear, that a child they had watched grow might not return. Church services incorporated prayers for her safe return. Town meetings dedicated time to discussing search strategies and coordinating with law enforcement. Every aspect of Ashbrook seemed suspended in a state of waiting, a fragile hope that lingered amid the tension. The sheriff's office, small but determined, began to chart the search zones meticulously. Each piece of evidence, however minor, was cataloged and analyzed. Footprints near a riverbank, a slightly disturbed patch of dirt on a logging trail, a discarded notebook or backpack fragment. The detective spoke cautiously to the press, careful not to spread panic, but unable to hide the fact that the investigation was growing increasingly complex. They interviewed classmates, neighbors, and strangers, piecing together the last known movements of Clara. Every conflicting account, every uncertainty, only deepened the sense that there was more to this disappearance than a typical teenage runaway. It was becoming clear that the forest was not merely a location but a labyrinth, a living puzzle resisting the efforts of those searching for answers. Emotionally, this period was a slow, creeping descent into despair. The family's grief was magnified by the community's gaze. The Dwyers felt exposed. Every moment of tension, every sigh and tear scrutinized by friends, neighbors, and strangers alike. Martha's anxiety manifested in restless pacing, repeated phone calls to authorities, and obsessive checking of the woods surrounding her home. Paul, by contrast, carried his grief in silence, his withdrawn demeanor interpreted by some as detachment, by others as stoic support. The emotional contrast between mother and father mirrored the contrast between the forest and the town. One active, reaching out desperately, the other reserved, observing quietly but intensely. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes in the Dwyer household's dynamic. Friends of Clara reported that Martha seemed more controlling than ever, questioning about minor interactions with her daughter, probing for information, seeking reassurance. Paul, meanwhile, avoided conversation, moving through rooms without making eye contact, his presence heavy but silent. These behaviors, innocuous in isolation, created an undercurrent of unease that permeated the town, a subtle recognition that the disappearance had not only shattered a life, but had fractured the very foundation of what the town believed about this family. As the days became weeks, the initial frantic energy of the search started to mingle with an almost eerie resignation. Volunteers still combed the forest, the riverside, and the trails, but each day brought fewer new clues. The town's hope ebbed slowly, replaced by a creeping dread that perhaps the truth would remain just out of reach. Yet even as despair settled in, the forest continued to resist disclosure, holding its breath, keeping secrets beneath its moss-covered floorboards and tangled roots. Every passerby felt the weight of that silence, the kind of emptiness that presses down on a small town when something innocent is lost and nothing seems capable of returning it. In these weeks, the emotional texture of Ashbrook became a combination of fear, tension, and the hollow ache of waiting. Each day was punctuated by the sound of distant sirens, the crunch of boots over wet leaves, the murmured conversations of volunteers piecing together threads of hope and uncertainty. The forest loomed over all of it, not threatening in a conventional sense, but as an almost conscious presence, a place that remembered every step taken upon its soil and every secret whispered within its boundaries. And within that tension, within the quiet surveillance of the trees and river, Clara Dwyer's absence became more than just a missing person case. It became a presence in itself, a void that demanded to be acknowledged, a mystery that would not relent until the truth emerged. Months passed in Ashbrook with a rhythm that was both stagnant and tense. The initial frenzy of search parties, news coverage, and town meetings began to fade, leaving behind a lingering uncertainty that settled like dust over every home, street, and corner of the town. The Dwyer household, once polished and meticulously ordered, now carried a permanent shadow. Martha's movements became more ritualistic, her eyes scanning corners and hallways, as if expecting Clara to emerge from some hidden crevice. Paul's presence remained stoic, almost ghost-like, his silence thickening the air around the house. Within this stillness, an ordinary household took on the quality of mausoleum. Every object, every photograph, and every lock on a door seemed imbued with the weight of absence. It was during one of the police re-inspections of the Dwyer home that the discovery occurred. Investigators, retracing every corner with renewed diligence, found the old diary tucked behind insulation panels in the attic, a space so hidden that even the Dwyers themselves had long forgotten its existence. At first glance, it appeared to be just another teenage notebook. Floral patterns on the cover, pages slightly yellow with age, handwriting delicate and precise. But as the pages were carefully turned, a story began to emerge, one that far exceeded what anyone could have anticipated. The diary started innocuously, filled with ordinary teenage reflections, lessons from school, crushes on classmates, small frustrations about chores or homework. Clara's handwriting was neat, almost obsessive in its order, suggesting a young mind attempting to impose structure on a world that often felt unpredictable. Yet the tone shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the entries progressed. The diary became a repository for her fears, observations, and insights into her home life. She wrote about nights when she heard whispers behind closed doors, about moments when she felt her parents were watching her too closely, about instructions that were given quietly but carried the weight of command. It became clear that the diary was not just a record of adolescence. It was a map of control and secrecy. Clara's words hinted at restrictions imposed not with malice, but with a kind of obsessive concern for appearances, a need to keep the household's inner workings invisible to outsiders. Yet there were also hints of fear. Coded entries, phrases strung together like puzzles, words that seemed harmless to anyone, but themselves a warning to those who might read them. She wrote of doors that should never be opened, of things that are said only to the walls, and of a feeling that someone could hear her thoughts if she whispered them aloud. The investigators realized that the diary contained more than teenage musings. It was a window into a controlled life. They noted how Clara's observations, though subtle, pointed to dynamics that had been invisible to the outside world. She wrote about her mother's strict routines, her father's absence, and the subtle hierarchy of obedience that governed daily life. There were references to previous incidents, little fragments of events that might otherwise be dismissed, but, when combined, hinted at a larger pattern of secrecy and tension. Emotionally, the diary acted as a bridge between the girl who had vanished and the adults left behind, offering a voice that had been silenced in real time but lived on in ink. It contained fear and courage intertwined. Fear of reprisal, fear of being misunderstood, but also courage in the act of recording, of leaving a trace for someone, someday, to uncover. It suggested a young mind fully aware of the danger in speaking too freely, yet unwilling to surrender entirely to silence. The discovery of the diary reshaped the investigation. Detectives pored over every entry, comparing handwriting, cross-referencing dates, and matching observations with the timeline of Clara's last known movements. The diary introduced new questions and cast old ones in a sharper, more unsettling light. What had Clara known? Who had she trusted enough to confide in her writing? And most chilling of all, what secrets had been carefully hidden behind the polished exterior of the Dwyer home for so many years? For the audience, this moment marks the first true revelation. The missing girl is no longer an absence, a void defined solely by her disappearance. She becomes a narrator of her own story, her voice bleeding across the years through carefully constructed words. The diary transforms the narrative from a simple case of a vanished teenager into a study of control, fear, and the small but profound ways a family's hidden truths can shape a child's life. In cinematic terms, this is a turning point where the story shifts from search and speculation to discovery and revelation. The diary is a character of its own, a silent witness, an intermediary, a vessel of truth that exposes what the town, and perhaps even the family, have been unwilling to see. Its pages carry both clarity and ambiguity, allowing the audience to feel the tension of what has been hidden and the fragility of a girl's voice caught between obedience, fear, and courage. As the section closes, attention lingers on the attic itself. Dusty beams, shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the roof, and the diary resting on the floor like a fragile heart, waiting to be read. The attic, once empty and silent, now holds the first echoes of the story that will unfold. A story that begins with a missing girl, but promises to uncover secrets that were never meant to be revealed. The diary's pages, once innocuous and mundane, began to reveal a layer of complexity and darkness that no one had anticipated. Clara's neat handwriting, carefully inked in blue, chronicled more than ordinary teenage thoughts. It was a map of her awareness, a coded record of the life she had been living within the walls of her home. As the investigators read on, they discovered entries that hinted at something far deeper than a teenager's frustration with schoolwork or desire for independence. Clara wrote about nights she could not sleep, about footsteps outside her room that carried intent, not accident, and about the sense that her life was constantly being measured, observed, and constrained by invisible rules. Each sentence seemed loaded with meaning, a message that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to piece it together. Among the earliest chilling revelations were references to the basement door, a place that seemed unremarkable to outsiders, but was, in Clara's words, a threshold between the known and the forbidden. She described hearing conversations that were whisper but sharp in tone, warnings that some things are not to be remembered, and instances where she felt compelled to obey without question, not out of fear of punishment, but out of an almost ritualistic sense of dread. The diary entries were not frantic or chaotic. They were precise, deliberate, as if Clara understood the danger in exposing too much too quickly. The coded language she used would later allow investigators to unlock critical insights into family's hidden past. It became increasingly evident that Clara was not merely chronicling a life of teenage anxiety. She was documenting the contours of control within her household. The diary hinted at the existence of a sibling, a sister who had disappeared before me, though official records identified Clara as an only child. This discrepancy prompted detectives to dig deeper into cold cases and missing child reports from the surrounding counties. One case, involving a toddler found near the river several years earlier, bore unsettling similarities to the timeline and descriptions in Clara's writing. Though initially considered unrelated, these entries began to form a pattern that suggested the family's carefully maintained image masked a history of trauma and possibly tragedy. The diary's psychological weight became apparent as each page was examined. Clara wrote about moments of fleeting joy, small acts of rebellion, and her yearning for freedom, all juxtaposed with passages that conveyed profound apprehension. She described how her mother could shift in tone from nurturing to commanding within moments, how her father's silence could feel like both protection and threat, and how the house itself seemed alive with unspoken rules. The investigators recognized that the diary was not only a record of daily life. It was a psychological blueprint, an insight into the mechanisms of control and secrecy that had shaped Clara's perception of the world. The entries also contained subtle foresight. Clara hinted that she had begun to question the narrative she had been told, to connect dots that no adult around her seemed willing to acknowledge. Lines like, "Sometimes I think the walls remember what we do in the dark," and "The forest listens better than anyone in this house," suggested an awareness that the truth might eventually be revealed, and that she was preparing, even in small ways, to expose it. The diary was a vessel of both fear and courage. Fear of reprisal from those closest to her, courage in her insistence on recording the reality she saw. Investigators found themselves piecing together the implications slowly, aware that each entry was both literal and metaphorical. The diary's passages regarding her mother's strictness, the father's absence, and the mysterious sibling created a framework that hinted at family secrets, possibly criminal in nature, that had been carefully hidden under the veneer of a perfect Oregon household. The tone of Clara's writing shifted as the diary progressed, from anxious observation to quiet determination, as if she were deliberately leaving breadcrumbs for someone to find, someone outside her home who might finally understand. Emotionally, the diary's revelations were a kind of slow-burning horror. The fear Clara experienced was subtle, not theatrical, but palpable. It was a fear born of daily life, of an environment where normal childhood interactions were overlaid with rules and silences that carried weight far beyond what any outsider could perceive. This made the reader or viewer, in cinematic terms, feel the tension not through shock, but through empathy, through the realization that this girl had lived every day under a pressure that no one around her fully recognized. As the investigators continued to decode Clara's writing, the diary became central to understanding the disappearance. Every cryptic entry, every coded sentence, every hint at a sibling or past tragedy suggested that Clara had uncovered truths about her family that may have placed her in direct danger. The diary transformed from a passive artifact into an active guide. It pointed toward hidden spaces, untold events, and the psychological mechanisms at play in a household. By the end of this section, the diary had evolved in meaning. It was no longer simply a teenager's journal. It was a testimony, a map, and a warning. Clara's observations illuminated the patterns of control, secrecy, and possibly past crimes within her family, setting the stage for the unraveling of the household's carefully maintained facade. Cinematically, the camera would linger over the inked pages, zooming in on cryptic sentences, tracing the flow of her pen as it connected her thoughts to the unseen events they described. The audience begins to understand that the missing girl was not only a victim of circumstance, but also an astute observer of the darkness that existed within the very place that should have been her sanctuary. In this way, the diary serves as a bridge between disappearance and revelation, between fear and courage, and between the mundane world of teenage life and the hidden realities that the family had carefully buried. It is through these pages that the audience comes to realize the stakes are far higher than they initially appeared, that the story is no longer simply about a girl who vanished, but about the truths that her absence and her words together will eventually expose. The focus of the investigation gradually shifted from the missing girl herself to the family she had left behind, particularly Martha Dwyer. For years, she had been seen by the town as the epitome of small-town composure and domestic warmth. The mother who baked pies for church socials, who greeted neighbors with practiced smile, whose life seemed perfectly arranged. But in the wake of Clara's disappearance, that image began to fracture. Subtle cracks in her demeanor became impossible to ignore. Friends and neighbors started noticing things they had either overlooked or rationalized before. A sudden, sharp tone in her voice when questioned about Clara, an unusual insistence on maintaining appearances, a hyper-focus on the details of the search, as if controlling the outward narrative could somehow influence the missing girl's fate. Martha's unraveling was not immediate, but cumulative. Every day, without Clara, seemed to erode her composure a little more. Photographs that once portrayed a cheerful family now hung like monuments to absence, each frame a reminder of what had vanished. She paced the floors of the Dwyer home, sometimes whispering to herself, sometimes simply staring out the windows at the dense Oregon forest, as if searching for something the eye could not see. Her laughter, which had once been measured and comforting, now carried a brittle edge, an undercurrent of tension that made casual conversation difficult. The neighbors who once admired her warmth began to feel a sense of unease, a recognition that the house was no longer merely a home. It was a locus of anxiety, suspicion, and secrets that might never fully be uncovered. The police interviews brought the change into sharper relief. Martha, who initially answered questions with calm, rehearsed responses, began to flinch when probed about specific incidents. Her eyes would dart to the side, her hands trembling slightly as she held on to the edge of the chair or the kitchen counter. The controlled demeanor she had mastered over decades was slipping, replaced by micro-expressions that betrayed fear, guilt, and a keen awareness that something she had hidden might soon surface. Detectives noted her contradictions, small inconsistencies in her stories that, taken alone, seemed minor, but together painted a picture of a woman who was carefully, almost desperately, maintaining a facade that was slowly crumbling. Neighbors' recollections contributed to the sense of growing unease. Some remembered nights when the house seemed unusually lit for hours, curtains drawn, shadows moving behind windows in patterns that suggested whispered arguments or secretive activity. Others recalled fleeting glimpses of Martha in the early morning, moving quickly through the yard, clutching something tightly, her face tense. Friends of Clara noticed a shift in how Martha interacted with them, questioning them repeatedly about their last encounters with the girl, probing for details that might indicate where she had been or what she had been thinking. This obsessive need for information, framed by the outward appearance of concern, added to the sense that Martha's maternal instincts were intertwined with an underlying rigidity and control that could, in some ways, feel oppressive. Paul Dwyer's presence during this time served as a counterpoint. Silent and reserved, he moved through the home with a quiet intensity, his actions deliberate, almost ritualistic. His grief was internalized, his emotion expressed in minimal gestures rather than words. Where Martha's anxiety manifested outwardly, Paul's took the form of observation, watching the searchers, the forest, and sometimes his wife, as if trying to measure each movement, each word, each possibility. The contrast between mother and father created a tension that colored every interaction, a dynamic that investigators noted repeatedly. In the Dwyer household, silence and control had always existed side by side, but Clara's disappearance exposed their fragility, laying bare the family's psychological landscape. The diary, discovered months earlier, now began to influence perceptions of Martha in profound ways. Investigators revisited entries that described her controlling tendencies, the strict rules imposed within the household, and moments when Clara expressed fear or unease around her mother. While the diary alone could not prove wrongdoing, it painted a portrait of a woman whose grip on her family had been intense and pervasive. The careful control that seemed benign or even admirable in public now took on a more sinister quality. For the audience, Martha transformed from a background figure into a central character in the unfolding drama, a woman whose outward smile masked a complex interplay of fear, control, and secrets. Emotionally, this section is unsettling because it asks the viewer to reconcile what they see with what they hear. Martha's composure and civility contrast sharply with the tension in her body, the fleeting expressions of worry or frustration, and the diary's accounts of her controlling behavior. The audience begins to sense that this is a story not merely about a missing girl, but about the invisible power dynamics that shape her world, the unseen pressures that may have contributed to her disappearance. It is in this contrast, public appearance versus private reality, that the narrative gains depth, evoking a sense of empathy, horror, and curiosity all at once. As the investigation intensified, Martha's interactions became increasingly fragile. Simple questions about the day Clara disappeared could elicit long pauses, sideways glances, or forced laughter meant to deflect attention. Detectives noted the tension in her voice, the subtle quiver of her hands, and the way she seemed to measure each response. These behaviors, while perhaps unconscious, spoke volumes about a household structured around control and secrecy, about a mother whose image had been carefully curated but whose inner life was now exposed to scrutiny. By the end of this period, Martha Dwyer had shifted from a peripheral figure of domestic perfection to a central character in the unraveling narrative. Her composure had cracked, revealing layers of complexity, fear, and potential culpability that were previously hidden behind the polished exterior of a small-town life. The emotional tension was now palpable, both for the investigators and for the audience, who began to understand that the missing girl's story could not be told without examining the fractured dynamics of the family she had left behind. In cinematic terms, Martha's unraveling provided a haunting contrast to the earlier sections. Where Clara's absence was a story of loss and uncertainty, Martha's behavior introduced a human element of tension, suspicion, and the looming possibility that the secrets hidden within the home were far more consequential than anyone had imagined. The diary had begun to transform the investigation, turning what seemed like a straightforward missing person case into something far more intricate and disturbing. Its pages hinted not just at a teenage rebellion or a temporary flight from home, but at family secrets that had been buried so deeply that even the Dwyers themselves may have believed they were safe. Clara's entry spoke of forbidden rooms, whispered conversations, and a sibling who had disappeared before her, a reference that contradicted public records and sent investigators back decades into the family's history. Each line was a breadcrumb, and the careful reader could see Clara mapping the labyrinth of control and silence that defined her life. The discovery of these secrets shifted the town's attention. Ashbrook, a community that had once defined itself by routine and predictability, suddenly found itself peering into spaces it had never noticed before. Neighbors began to reflect on past encounters. Strange behaviors, unexplained absences, the odd precision with which the Dwyers maintained appearances. Small incidents, dismissed at the time as quirks or eccentricities, were suddenly imbued with new meaning. A car parked overnight in the driveway with no explanation, doors left locked for weeks, conversations cut short when Clara entered a room. All these moments became pieces of a puzzle no one had realized they were already a part of. Investigators started to reconstruct the family's past, scrutinizing old records, interviewing distant relatives, and looking into previous police reports. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered a shadow beneath the Dwyers' polished surface. Previous incidents, long forgotten or dismissed, began to appear as patterns. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments in the middle of the night, unusual comings and goings of people no one could identify, and subtle but persistent signs that someone, or perhaps several someones, had been silenced or kept invisible over the years. Each discovery added layers of complexity to the case, highlighting a duality between the family's outward perfection and the private tensions hinted at in Clara's writing. Martha Dwyer, already fragile under the weight of public scrutiny, now faced renewed attention. Detectives asked increasingly detailed questions about past events, about Clara's earlier diary entries, and about any family history that might explain the cryptic references. Martha's composure began to crack further, revealing micro-expressions of anxiety, the quiver in her hands, and moments where her voice faltered. Paul, ever silent and reserved, maintained a stoic presence, but his occasional glances toward Martha and the investigators suggest a man observing a delicate balance that was threatening to collapse. Together, they formed a tense tableau, the parents as both witnesses and participants in a drama that had long been hidden behind closed doors. As the diary's revelations came to light, investigators began to focus on the timeline leading up to Clara's disappearance. They traced her movements, matched them to the diary's entries, and noted the subtle signals she left behind. Comments about feeling watched, mentions of strange visitors, and cryptic references to what she described as doors that should never be opened. Each line suggested Clara had been aware of something the adults around her were intent on keeping hidden. The diary, once an intimate record of her daily life, had become a roadmap of fear, curiosity, and foresight, showing that she had recognized patterns and dangers that no adult had articulated. Emotionally, this section of the story emphasizes the mounting tension between perception and reality. The town, the investigators, and the family are all forced to confront the idea that the narrative they had accepted, the one of a happy, normal family, was incomplete and in some ways misleading. The contrast between the serene Oregon landscapes and the psychological turbulence of the Dwyer household amplifies this tension, creating an unsettling atmosphere where beauty and dread coexist. Clara's diary also introduced the possibility that her disappearance was not random or accidental. The carefully documented observations, the notes on family routines, and the subtle warnings suggested she may have been targeted, or at the very